So last week we looked at the letter writing process, and I hope that was helpful as you guys looked at a letter this week. Now we saw that it was from Paul and from Timothy, so they would have been a team writing that. And it was to Philemon, Apphia, who is most likely his wife, Archippus, who may have been their adult son. Archippus is mentioned in Colossians, and the church that meets in their house. Now, we need to remember that there were no church buildings then. So all of the churches were home churches. One of the things I read estimated that probably the average size of a church would have been at most 20 to 30, maybe 40 if it was a really large house, but you can only squash so many people in. In this letter, Philemon is called a dear friend, fellow worker, brother, and a partner. So we know that there had to be a really close relationship between Paul and Philemon. The letter was written and delivered at the same time as the letter to Colossians, the book we have of Colossians, and we get some additional information there. The letter was delivered by, and there is an appropriate introduction of Tychicus at the end of Colossians, like we had talked about last week. And the greetings, so-and-so says hi, are identical between the two books, so we know that the same group went that. Colossae is a town that's about 120 miles east of Ephesus. And so Paul is in Ephesus, or he might be in Rome. There's a lot of discussion about that. Philemon was evidently a man of wealth and status in that town. So having done that part of the introduction, then Paul goes on and continues the opening section with a prayer of praise and also petition for Philemon. He was filled with joy and gratitude because of Philemon's love and his faith toward the Lord Jesus and also to the community of saints, and he refreshed the hearts of God's people there. His prayer, the petition in verse 6, is a little bit tricksy to translate. The subject part of that is translated, the sharing of your faith with us in the faith. Know what I'm doing here, Natalie. The Greek word is actually the koinonia. It's the koinonia of your faith. Now, some of you who've been around church for kind of a long time, we know that word koinonia. It means fellowship. It may well have been the label for when you all gathered and you had coffee and small talk and hopefully cookies. But I don't think that actually captures the fullness of what that word entails. So the word means partner, sharer, fellowship, although that's actually more like Fellowship of the Ring than it is like Fellowship Hall. Sorry. And the element of generosity is very often included in that word as well. Paul uses koinonia twice in this little letter. He uses it in the opening and then again later. And we talked about watching for that. In verse 17, he says to Philemon, if you consider me your partner, and he uses koinonia there, welcome Onesimus as you would welcome me. Now, Paul knows that because they are comrades in arms, that he could show up and be welcomed by Philemon. And so what he's asking is, hey, treat Onesimus just like you would treat me. The request is built on the relationship that the two men have, that Philemon and Paul have. So the request is actually based on koinonia. In verse 6, be nuanced in a number of different ways, which is why there's different translations. They aren't radically different from each other. Dr. H.M. Carson summed up the whole idea of what that petition is, and I liked it. I summarized it because it was long. But basically what he says is, Philemon's faith is to be a blessing to be enjoyed in common with others. Such a sharing would lead to a growth in knowledge, a clear grasp of spiritual realities, and all the blessings that are a Christian's heritage. Faith is the source of the knowledge, and faith grows into maturity in fellowship with others. And it's in that fellowship where there is a deepening of the knowledge. So he sees the cycle of faith, knowledge, faith, knowledge, faith, knowledge that grows because we are doing it together, because there is community. So with that, Paul finishes up the opening and he moves into the body of the letter. And the whole thing is really an appeal on behalf of Onesimus. And Paul kind of pulls out all stops. He begins, tucked in there is, I could command you, but I won't, but I could. And evidently that was a common literary thing that would show up in speeches in that day. We saw in the Bible Project video last week how status and rank really were important in the Roman culture of that day. And socially, Philemon outranks Paul. He was a rich, probably landowner businessman. Paul's in jail, and he's an itinerant traveler. But spiritually, within the church, Paul outranks Philemon. And Onesimus is a slave. He has no rank anywhere. So Paul begins by appealing to sympathy. I'm an old man, and I'm in jail for Jesus' sake. You can just sort of hear the little whine in that one. I thought it was funny. The word that is used for old here, technically in that day, would refer to somebody who was between 49 and 56. So, you know, some of you are pushing old way before you thought you were going to. Casually, I gather, it was also used for anybody that wasn't young anymore. But it is estimated that probably Paul was in his 50s at this point. Their age span does not last as long as ours tends to. Then Paul refers to Onesimus' uselessness to Philemon and his usefulness to Paul, and Paul's deep love for him as a spiritual son. He hints at the sovereignty of God, saying that maybe that was involved, that Onesimus would have left as a slave and returned as a brother. And he appeals to the close relationship that Paul has with Philemon. And he offers to pay any financial loss that Philemon might have had because of Onesimus. The way that it's worded in that section, and the fact that Paul stops in the middle of the letter and actually signs his name, would have made that a legally binding document. So Philemon could have taken that to court and say, okay, Paul owes me this amount of money, and it would have held. So Paul is putting teeth to that offer. It's not just a casual, yeah, if I owe you something. And then Paul pulls another idea that is up in his opening, and he repeats again, and that's the fact that Philemon has had a habit of refreshing the hearts of the saints in Colossae. And Paul would like him to refresh Paul's heart by doing this for him. He assures Philemon that he believes the very best about him. And actually, this has been a very complimentary letter for Philemon, other than the fact that there's a pretty expensive hook embedded in all of that. As we look over the letter, it's a very systematic, organized argument for Philemon to forgive Onesimus and to be reconciled. Except that's not really what it's saying. Paul is calling Philemon to more than forgiveness. He never mentions forgiveness, because forgiveness is foundational, but it was assumed that that's part of what you do as a Jesus follower. You forgive. so he doesn't have to tell Philemon that. And he's calling Philemon to more than reconciliation, because reconciliation is making things go back the way they had been. And he's not calling him to that same relationship. He is saying, look at Onesimus. He was his social inferior. He was a slave who probably betrayed him. And he's saying, treat him as your equal. In fact, more than your equal, treat him as your brother. That's way beyond reconciliation. I don't think we in our culture can actually catch the shock and the horror of what this request would have been. It broke all of the social inclination to want justice. Paul took a really big risk in sending this letter. Onesimus was a rich man. He was used to people doing what he said. Outside of this tiny little gathering of Jesus followers, the line between master and slave was very clear and very enforced. If Philemon welcomes back a runaway slave who most likely robbed him when he left, it will be seen as weakness with his peers. He will be shamed in his community. A letter like this could have ended his friendship with Paul. He might have even decided that if this is what it means to be a Christian, I don't want to do this. He might have completely walked away from God, and that would have shattered the little church in Colossae. But in spite of that risk, Paul sent the letter. Philemon could have rejected the request and had Onesimus executed. Onesimus, who is now Paul's spiritual son and is his very heart. But in spite of that risk, Paul sent Onesimus. I think for Paul, this is not just about two people. I think that he might see this as a core aspect of what it means to be a Christian, to be one of God's people. The sister letter, which was sent at the same time to Colossians, to Colossae, that book of Colossians that we know, we don't know how many house churches there were in Colossae. But it's very possible that when the believers gathered to hear the letter to Philemon read, they also listened to the letter of Colossians being read. And in that sister letter, Paul writes, here being the body of Christ, there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free, for Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, and you remember we talked about that hinge word, therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with each other. Forgive one another if any has a grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And over all these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace. If we look at Paul's life and at his letters, we can see that one thing that he is really, really passionate about is that the racial, ethnic, religious, social, economic divisions that defined his culture do not belong in the people of God. And I think that he looked at this situation between himself and Philemon and Onesimus and saw it as a living object lesson to what should be happening in the church as a whole. So let me read that section I just read, and you hold in your mind that this is being written to the same people who are trying to figure out how to navigate what just happened with Philemon and with Onesimus. So hold that in mind and hear. Here there is no Gentile or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free. But Christ is all and is in all. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourself with compassion and kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if you have a grievance against someone. Forgive as God has forgiven you. And over all these virtues, put on love, which binds them together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body, you are called to peace. Our culture does not have the built-in structured divides that the first century had. But we are deeply fractured and divided. And sadly, sometimes Christians have not been the light that Paul has longed for, the light that shows the potential of unity and the value of all people. Sometimes Christians have actually made it worse. Jesus died to take our sin and to bring each one of us individually into a right relationship with Jesus Christ. But he also died to bring broken humanity back together and to create one united people of God. When our actions or our words deepen divides that exist, we're actually working against Jesus, and we are denying his death and resurrection. There's a lot of women here. We do not agree on all things religious. We are different churches. We will have different views on things. Odds are about 100% that we do not agree on all things political. We probably don't agree on who should win which sports games. We might not even agree at what time you should go to bed. And that's okay, because we aren't trying to create little cookie cutters. But it is important that we live together with grace. On the tables, as you go out, there's a couple of handouts that are put out by Braver Angels. That's an organization that is trying to diffuse some of the political rhetoric in our nation and to help reds and blues talk together and listen. All of their examples are going to be political. But I think they fit in any situation where there is conflict. So you might take those and look at them as you go out. In my research, I found two things, particularly in this letter, that made Paul seem manipulative to some people. So I want to address those in case they struck you that same way. The first one is the fact that Paul says he wants Philemon to make up his own decision. And then he has this long, really well-organized section that is clearly designed to convince Philemon to do what Paul wants him to do. And it felt, a little hypocritical. I think that's a place where we miss the culture of the day. Rhetoric, the art of persuasive speech, was an honored skill at that point. They taught it in all schools, and the upper level schools, there were ones that was the whole focus of what they did. There were a whole variety of different types of persuasive speech, and each one had its pattern that you would follow if you were doing this kind or this kind or this kind. They would have contests about who could give the best persuasive speeches, and the crowds and the judges would be evaluating not only how well they used their words, but how persuasive it was. Paul is right in the middle of normal when he writes this letter. So Philemon might have had a wry smile after he heard it and said, "That was a good speech. I feel the power." But he would not have been offended. We actually have the same kind of thing. The job and the major in college is called marketing. And we are surrounded by people who are trying to convince us of things. We should vote this way. We should buy this. We should, lots of marketing around us. The cost of a 30-second Super Bowl commercial in 2023 was $7 million. Now, that was up from $6.5 million in 2022. That is ridiculous. But we know that there's a lot of people who really watch the Super Bowl for the commercials more than they do for the football. We might fall into that category. Does that mean that when we say, that's the coolest commercial, it was so funny, that we're immediately going to go out and buy it? No. But the companies are willing to put that much money in because they know it works for some people. So, yeah, we get it. It's just our rhetoric tends to be visual, and theirs was in speeches. I was listening to an online discussion about Philemon, and one of the people expressed the view that Paul is being merely manipulative because he sends what is in essence a pretty personal private note to be read to the whole church. And he felt like that would mean that Philemon would be shamed into following what Paul wanted him to do. And it is definitely a letter to the whole church. You know, it begins by mentioning, and the church at your house, and in the end, where it talks about your prayers, and it talks about the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with your spirit, those are plural, so he's including the whole church in that, not just Philemon. But I think when we view it that way, we miss Paul's heart. Onesimus's primary offense was against Philemon. But it was public information. Everybody in that household knew what happened. Everybody in the church knew what happened. And probably everybody that lived on the block knew what happened. So if Onesimus was actually going to be welcomed back and accepted as a brother, it had to be by the whole group. They all needed to hear Paul's logic and Paul's heart on why he should be accepted. The call to forgiveness and unity wasn't just for Philemon, it was for the full church. And is really challenging, both personally and also socially. Philemon was going to need the support of his church to help him step forward and do this, and to deal with the social fallout that he would probably face. So they all needed to understand why it mattered and how they could encourage Philemon. In essence, part of what Paul is saying is, Philemon, I know that Onesimus is your slave, and he wasn't a very good one at that. But you are part of the family of God, and now he has joined that family, and you have a family responsibility for him. I was thinking about that. I was thinking about our family responsibility. In Philemon's day, it's a tiny little family. Well, over the centuries, it has become a huge family of God. I mean, there's a lot of us gathered here. We have hundreds of brothers and sisters in Loveland and across the country. And when we stop and we look at the needs that our brothers and sisters around the globe are facing, it can really be overwhelming to think, I have a family responsibility for all these people. It becomes more than what our hearts, and certainly more than what our pocketbooks, can deal with. So we can open ourselves and really enter into all of these needs and end up overwhelmed and depressed. Or we can close ourselves off and say, not my problem. Unless it happens to be our immediate family, or my closest friends, or maybe somebody in my church. But clearly, neither one of those are God's desire for us. So here are some thoughts about how we can embrace the fact that we have a very big family without getting overwhelmed. Number one, it's not on our shoulders. This is God's family, and it's his responsibility to care for his children. He has the plans, he has the power, and he's got all the resources. Our part is to have soft hearts that will listen and gentle hearts that will act. So our soft hearts can help us feel the pain of the world and weep with those who weep. That can be neighbors with cancer. That can be looking at our cities and our country and just weeping for the pain of the division and the strife and the hatred. Or we can look at Libya and Morocco and Ukraine. But we can pick up that pain and not draw it in. We pick up the pain and we carry it to Jesus because he can handle it. He can carry it. He's capable. We are not. If we draw all that into ourselves, we will be crushed. But our soft hearts also help us listen to God. And he will tell us which one of those needs out there are the ones that we are supposed to act on. Because the rest of them are assigned to somebody else. We don't need to pick up everything. And our generous hearts will have us act when he says, that one's yours. It might be a financial thing. But more often, it is a generosity of our time and of our heart, which honestly usually costs us more than money. And I think it takes both. It takes the soft heart and the generous heart to fulfill our family responsibility. I want to bring this a little bit closer to home. I think within the church, we do a better job of living in community and supporting one another than many areas of our culture. But let's face it, we can get busy. We can get caught up in our own world and in our own life and forget. We forget that somebody had surgery and I said I would pray today. We forget to follow up on a need that was shared with us. We forget to notice the people around us, even the people in our church, certainly the people outside. I know I've been guilty of that. We care when we see. And I'm asking that the Lord will make us more attentive to one another. But there's another side of being in the family. I've gone to Cameroon 4 times and taught women over there. And one of the times, my translator, they speak Kom. I don't speak Kom. Most of them don't speak English. So my translator was a young mom, had elementary school age children, and was newly widowed. And she was telling me, not whining, but that things were really hard. And sometimes she didn't have enough food for dinner. And she would go to her neighbors and say, we don't have enough food for dinner. Can we eat with you today? And she went with no shame, and she went expecting a welcome. And I was cut to the quick, because I thought, they understand community way better than we do. When we need help, we might go to the food bank, but we're probably not going to tell anybody we know that we are that tight. So I was thinking all about this before the accident. And God's given me some very real object lessons. When it first happened, I couldn't bend over. It just hurt too bad. So I would drop something on the floor and then think, Bob, could you come pick this up? And I felt so stupid. And I've been sleeping on the couch with pillows because laying flats just are not a good idea. And we have a couch in the basement that has a recliner in it. So Bob said I should try that. So I went down and I got in, and the position I got into was really uncomfortable. But every way I tried to wiggle to get out was beyond uncomfortable. And I had my phone, so I texted my husband, who was upstairs, and said, "Would you please come rescue me?" And he came down and lifted me out, and I cried. I don't like having needs. I'm not the only one like that. Now, you may not have been caught in a wicked recliner of pain, but all of us have been there. There's such a wide variety of ways that we can end up with needs. Hevel exists, you know? We talked about that last year. It is part of life, and it might not be part of your life right now, but I guarantee it has been, or it will be. Part of being family means having the courage to say, I have a need. There should be no shame in the family of God. This is where we find love and grace and comfort. Now, maybe you did reach out and it actually didn't go so well. I would encourage you to try again and ask the Spirit of God to show you a safe person, because they exist. So we're going to take 1 minute of silence. And I want you to begin a conversation. 1 minute is not long enough to finish it, so I have to talk with God later. But I want you to take a little bit of time and begin the conversation that says, is there somebody I need to reach out to? I need to be family for? Is there some need I need to be brave enough to share? Or maybe God would like to say something altogether different. But after the end of our silence, we're going to sing the first chorus of the song that we opened with. Now, when we opened, you all politely looked forward and looked at the words. I want you to do this time. I want you to turn and look at each other and make the declaration to one another. We are one in the bond of Christ. So, we'll be quiet for a minute